I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1733 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the Kent State tragedy where 4 young people were gunned down by the Ohio National Guard. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of that terrible event that occurred on May the 4th, 1970. There was a story about that terrible event in the Herald newspaper located over in Sharon, Pennsylvania, that did a real good job of not only telling about the event, but explaining what was going on over there and what led to the invasion of Cambodia. The title of that story was Kent State Explosion Came from a Fuse Lit in Cambodia. It was submitted by none other than ERIC Poole, a writer for the Herald, over there in Sharon, Pennsylvania. He did a great job. That's another reason I'm sharing it with you, because he gives excellent background to what caused the whole thing in the first place. Let's take a look at what ERIC has to say. Dateline, Sharon, Pennsylvania. The campus protests that roiled this nation 50 years ago traced their origins to a jungle path that wound its way several hundred miles through Laos and Cambodia beneath the cover of double and triple canopy jungle. That path was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail in honor of a man who spent his life fighting for Vietnam's independence, first alongside the Americans and French against Japan during World War II. Then against France following the war, and finally against the United States until his death in 1969. But it would have been vastly underplaying the Ho Chi Minh Trail to paint it as just a path through the jungle. In fact, it was a network of dirt highways weaving and intersecting one another with built-in redundancy to prevent a washout or a lucky blind shot by U.S. Air Force bombers from stopping the flow of men and materials south into the heart of South Vietnam. If a part of the trail was put out of commission, the North Vietnamese Army would merely shift its logistics to a parallel route until repairs were made. And because of the primitive nature of the trail and the transportation, which often involved travel by foot, bicycle, or ox cart for the heaviest loads, repairs rarely kept the paths down for long. When the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive in January of 1968, they were able to achieve a surprise strike into the heart of South Vietnam, even penetrating the U.S. Embassy in the heart of what was then Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City today, because they could move large numbers of troops down the trail, concealed by that double and triple canopy jungle. The United States and its allies were almost powerless to stop that flow because the U.S. rules of engagement required they respect, for the most part, Laotian and Cambodian neutrality, even if the North Vietnamese did not. That's another reason the Vietnam War was so screwed up, because of things like that. If you're fighting a war with somebody, you got to go get them and kill them wherever they are. We shouldn't tie the hands of the military by placing irrational restraints on them. Back to the story. But in April of 1970, political events in Cambodia conspired to give President Richard Nixon the rationale he and the U.S. military needed to launch an assault on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. A coup that imitated art not only deposed its artist, but also drew the United States into unrest in Cambodia and at home, lit the fuse that exploded into conflagration on college campuses across the United States, and on Monday, May the 4th, 1970, the deaths of 4 young people on the campus of Kent State University. Prince Norodom Sihanouk steered the Cambodian ship of state off and on from the 1940s until the 2000s, shortly before his death in 2012. At the same time, he regarded himself as a creative man. His film, Spellbound Wood, was selected in 1967 for the Moscow International Film Festival. But it was another of his movies, Shadow over Angkor, that may have proved prescient. Shadow told the story of a fictional CIA-led coup against Sihanouk's regime. In early 1970, life imitated art when pro-Western Cambodian Prime Minister Lon Nol led an uprising that ousted Sihanouk. It really didn't oust Sihanouk. When that happened, Sihanouk was out of the country. So Lon Nol, who was the prime minister at the time, just assumed command. Sihanouk's sympathies had rested with the Soviets along with the Chinese Communists and their North Vietnamese allies. Conversely, Lon Nol was a more pro-Western leader, and he tried to deny the North Vietnamese use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The North Vietnamese responded with an invasion of Cambodia and threatened the smaller, weaker Cambodian army. On Thursday, April the 30th, 1970, Nixon announced his intent to invade Cambodia with U.S. troops, and on college campuses all hell broke loose. The Cambodian invasion, called Operation Ben Tay, translated from the Vietnamese as Tame the West, came after Nixon had promised for more than a year to de-escalate the Vietnam War and in his successful presidential campaign before taking office. Instead, the president was planning to expand the war. What he was actually planning to do was win the war and get the H out of that area. Continuing with Eric's story. 2 days later, Saturday, May the 2nd, protesters set Kent State's ROTC building on fire, a prelude to the shootings on May the 4th. What do you expect is going to happen when you set a college building on fire? There will be repercussions. For the U.S. soldiers who crossed the border on Nixon's orders, the trouble was only beginning. Units of the 4th Infantry Division, along with the 101st Airborne Division, storied 506th Infantry Regiment's 3rd Battalion. Pardon me, that's news to me. I was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam. I arrived there just as the 1st Cav Division was pulling out of Cambodia. The 101st Airborne Division at that time was located way north, up near Hue at Camp Eagle. I don't ever remember anybody in the division talking about the 3rd and the 506th going down and participating in the Cambodian invasion. I was always under the impression that it was primarily the 1st Cav Division that went in, with a few other units that were located down south. Not the 101st, but who knows? They could have been there. Maybe ERIC Poole was there reporting the situation. I was only there at the time with the 101st, and I don't remember the 3rd or the 506th going way down to the Parents Beak area. Anyway, just had to bring that up. Getting back to his story. The U.S. Army units, along with a whole bunch of ARVN units, carried out the invasion in northeast Cambodia. During World War II, the 506th included Easy Company, later to become famous as the eponymous Band of Brothers from Stephen Ambrose's book and an Emmy-winning TV miniseries. I have to second that statement. The TV series was very good. Bravo Company of the 3rd and the 506th landed in Cambodia on May the 5th and was pulled out on May the 16th under heavy political pressure stemming from protest like the one at Kent State. The units sustained casualties of more than 40 wounded and 8 killed. Most of the casualties and all of the fatalities took place on one day in one battle, the May the 10th Mother's Day ambush. After Bravo Company lost 8 men killed and an estimated 48 men wounded on May the 10th, Captain Jim Waybright, company commander, said the U.S. force was pulled out of Cambodia in response to political pressure. Waybright said he thinks the protests, including the Kent State shootings, were a factor in convincing the nation's political and military leadership to cut short Operation Ben Tay. It got us out of Cambodia quickly, he said. Not that I wanted to see anybody killed or hurt, but we would have been there several more weeks or more. A note here, this article contains information from the book Company of Heroes, A Forgotten Medal of Honor and Bravo Company's War in Vietnam, by ERIC POOLE himself, who wrote this article. That book will be on the recommended reading list for this podcast episode. You can go over to the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com, check out episode 1733, and there will be a handy link right there where you can purchase that book and read all about it. I hope in the book that Mr. Poole mentions more about the 1st Cav Division, who spearheaded that invasion. Now you know more about the background leading up to the invasion of Cambodia. We were fighting an entire lopsided war over there. The North Vietnamese were using Laos and Cambodia as if they owned the place, at will, yet we weren't able to touch them over there because those two countries were neutral. So even though the murderous North Vietnamese were using it as safe havens and a superhighway to deliver men and material down to South Vietnam, we couldn't touch them. And when we did, all hell broke loose back on the campuses back here in the States. Unfortunately, that led to the deaths of 4 young people there at Kent State, which is a terrible thing. Unfortunately, many other people were dying in Vietnam as a result of actions by the murderous North Vietnamese who were intent upon reuniting that country and creating a communist paradise where hundreds of thousands of people would be murdered for the overall good. And you know, there are ignorant fools in this country today who are advocating more communism for our country. Those people are crazy. They should read a little bit of history about what communists do in places like Vietnam. If they were more aware of that, they would not be so big on favoring communist policies for this country. They're either stupid or totally out of their minds. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1733 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Go on over to the podcast website, Vietnam Veteran News, and get a copy of ERIC Poole's book, A Forgotten Medal of Honor and Bravo Company's War in Vietnam. I think you would enjoy it. Thank you very much for coming to listen to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?